Hey, this is Ash. This is just a quick demo of how Benthos tries to make config less sucky, and that's both in terms of writing a config from scratch if you don't know the spec very well, but then also in terms of diagnosing issues with the config if it's not quite giving you what you wanted. The first command I'm going to show you here is print-YAML. There's also print-JSON, and what that does is it prints an example config. So here we've got a standard in input and a standard out output, and it shows you all the main config sections of a Benthos config, which is kind of useful. However, because it's what I call sanitized, what it does is it's removed all the sections that aren't relevant to this particular config. So for example, we only see the standard in input fields, which is pretty useless because if we don't know what inputs are on offer, how are we going to write our config? So the next command I'm going to show you is the same, but with --all added on it. And what that's going to do is it's going to print the same config, but with every field included, even the ones that aren't relevant. Now, because of the way that a Benthos config is structured, that will also show you every single possible type of every section. So it tells you every input type, every output type, every buffer type, etc. And the way that it does that is they're listed as children of their respective sections. So for example, the Amazon_S3 input section tells you that there's an Amazon_S3 input type, and it also tells you all the fields that are available. You can carry on scrolling through this. You can see that there's a Kafka type. There's also a Kafka_balance type, MQTT, NATS, etc. So technically you could use this to write a config from scratch, because you could both discover what's available and then also see the format that those things take. But this still kind of sucks. This is still a sucky user experience. Shame on me. You could break this down a little bit by printing it as you could print it as JSON and then you could pipe it into a JQ query, for example. So here's a query where I'm extracting the input field and I'm putting it through the keys function. And what that'll do is it'll just list all the keys within a Benthos input type, and that effectively lists every single input type that's available. So for example, see HTTP client, NAT stream, Kafka balance, stuff like that. And if I were particularly intrigued by one of these, I could actually just dig into it. So I could isolate the input.kafka object and I could see all the config sections for that. But some of this stuff is self-explanatory. So for example, the Kafka input is self-explanatory and the fields it has are fairly self-explanatory, but there's some things that are a little bit more nuanced and can be confusing. So for example, the read_until input, what the hell does that do? If that looked like it was something you might be interested in, but you're not quite sure, how do you work that out? So normally I would tell you to go to the documentation in the repo, and it'll tell you exactly what that type is, but you can also just do that from the binary itself. So there's a command --list-- and then either inputs, outputs, buffers, processors, conditions, and what that'll do is it will print out the markdown documentation that you actually get in the repo itself. So I can go through this and I can find the bit that I'm interested in. So for example, I can do a search on read until. And what that will give me is a config snippet, and it also gives you a description of what this thing actually does, and potentially a caveat, stuff like that. And that's that. So you can use those tools to discover what's available. You can also read what they mean if you need a bit more information. Let's say I've worked out that I want a WebSocket input, I want a James path query to be applied to all messages, and I want it to be then written to Kafka. How do I create that config quickly without any prior knowledge? An obvious way to do it would be to print YAML --all into a file and then just delete the sections you're not interested in, and that would technically work. But again, that is a trash user experience. Who thought of that? Awful. So what I did instead is I added a command --example, and what that allows you to do is specify a comma separated list of types that you would like to include in the config, and then you could do something like pipe that into a file. So for example, here what I've done is I've said I want a WebSocket type, comma, and I want a James path type, comma, and then I want a Kafka type. So let's see what it made. Look at that. It's given us a WebSocket input, and it's given us all the WebSocket fields, and it's also given us two processes here. So this is interesting because there's actually two different James path types within Benthos. There's a James path processor, which we've got here, and then there's also a James path filter type, which we've got here. And I don't want the filter type, I'm going to remove that. And then finally we've got this Kafka output. Now that's it. I've got my config, I'm ready to go. If I were to run this, I get a list of error messages. Oh, look at him type, what an idiot. And that's because I don't have any of these services running. But let's say I have a few typos in my config and I try to run this now. So let's say I've specified /foo/bar on the end of my URL here for the WebSocket input type, but I've got a typo in, so this isn't actually going to do what I expect it to do. Now the first thing that will happen is it will give us an error immediately because the input type wasn't recognized. So that's nice. Good for you, Benthos. You get a point there. However, is it going to be able to tell us about the other issue? And the answer is no, because what will happen is it will apply WebSocket defaults, and then it doesn't recognize the WebSocker object that you've put in, and it's not going to kick up a fuss if it doesn't recognize a field. And that was a choice by me, but it does mean that it silently fails essentially for something like this. So it's entirely possible that this thing would run, and you'd see odd behaviors, but it might be something that's a bit nuanced. It's maybe a little bit difficult to spot. You know something's wrong, but you're not quite sure if it's the config or not. So how could you narrow down whether or not it is actually the config? And the way that you could do that is you point Benthos to the config itself, and then you can do the same print-YAML or print-JSON commands. And what that'll do is it will just print back to you how Benthos has interpreted your config. So for example here, I can actually look in the WebSocket section it's given me back, and I can see for myself that it has not got the correct URL. So now I know that there was a problem in my config somewhere. There's some issue with how it's written, or maybe I've just misinterpreted the structure, and that would then at least prompt me to go and have a look at this thing, and I can then see, oh yeah, actually there is a typo. And then what I can do is I can go back and I can just double check that it has correctly interpreted the URL. And it just gives you another way of trying to narrow down these issues. It's just another tool. It's not going to be a silver bullet or anything. But it is kind of useful. If you found that you had a massive config that was, say, like thousands of lines, this thing's running your business basically, and you wanted to try and break it down, well, you can use the same tools as before. So an interesting thing here is you can have a YAML config, but then print it out as a JSON config, and you can do the same vice versa. And that means I can read my YAML config file, print it as JSON, and then pipe it into JQ. So if I wanted to, say, look at the configuration of my processor, I can do a JQ query to just extract that specific section, and then I can double check the fields here. And obviously if you've got thousands of lines, then you could use this JQ syntax to just get through a little snippet of the config you're interested in looking at, and then you can do a sanity check with your own eyes. Sorry if you don't have any eyes, just to make sure that it's the correct thing. And that's it. That's all I want to demo now. Hopefully you found that interesting, or you didn't. Deal with it. Bye.